In Part 1, The Great Dutch Fracture of 1857, The Roots of Rebellion, we trace the deep-seated origins of 1857 back to state-controlled pulpits and the afscheiding secession of 1834. Driven across the Atlantic by political suppression and economic devastation, these devout Orthodox pioneers established a fragile home deep in the imposing forests of rural western Michigan, while their leader, Albertus van Raalte, orchestrated an ecclesiastical union with the established Reformed Church in America to preserve the fledgling colony from physical and economic ruin. Tensions grew. Subterranean tensions regarding Americanization, secret societies, and liturgical compromises rapidly eroded the alliance and trust, ultimately leaving the entire immigrant community deeply fractured and divided by 1857. By 1857, these unresolved anxieties culminated in an official localized split, giving birth to a tiny, highly vulnerable independent communion built on the strict church order of Dort. As we enter this second phase of the transatlantic journey, the overarching dynamic shifts from a story of localized rebellion to one of rapid institutional expansion and cultural adaptation. The mid-19th century survival of this fledgling independent church was by no means guaranteed, as it faced immense structural pressures and isolation in a vast new American landscape. It remained a small, isolated cluster of congregations, surrounded by a far larger, better-funded American religious landscape that threatened to absorb or completely erase their unique theological identity. To move past the status of a minor foreign-speaking sect, the community required a major structural catalyst to protect and permanently preserve their historic heritage for future generations. As the closing decades of the 19th century approached, a perfect storm of internal American denominational crises and massive state-endorsed European migration converged together in the booming Midwest. This convergence permanently secured the denomination's future, launching it into an era of unprecedented continental growth and complex modern challenges that would permanently redefine their sacred transatlantic journey. The survival of the fledgling Christian Reformed Church was initially uncertain, as it remained a small, isolated cluster of congregations surrounded by a far larger, better-funded American religious landscape. However, the closing decades of the 19th century brought a dual wave of cultural and institutional developments that permanently secured the denomination's future and fueled its historic transformation. This transformation into a resilient regional force was fueled by a primary catalyst that occurred in the early 1880s, when structural tensions over secret societies reached a breaking point. These structural tensions deeply within the Reformed Church in America over secret societies eventually reached a historic breaking point across many Midwestern congregations by the early 1880s. While the 1857 seceders had long identified membership in the Freemasons as an explicit compromise of Christian discipleship, many Midwestern congregations remaining inside the RCA tolerated the practice. These remaining Midwestern congregations had continued to tolerate the practice for years, sincerely hoping for an official denomination-wide prohibition against joining any secret lodge or society. This hope was shattered when the RCA's General Synod officially declined to declare church membership and lodge membership mutually incompatible in their final formal vote. The Synod's refusal to enforce a strict boundary line provoked immediate outrage across the Midwest, causing a major institutional fracture in the pioneer community by 1882. A prime example of this local trauma occurred in Holland, Michigan, where the historic Holland Reformed Protestant Dutch Church chose to sever its long-standing RCA affiliation entirely. The majority of the congregation voted to break fellowship and align with the seceders of 1857, reorganizing themselves as the Ninth Street Christian Reformed Church that same year. The minority, who wished to retain their historic denominational identity, walked away to establish First Reformed Church nearby, leaving their old sanctuary behind forever. This pattern of local division repeated across the region, injecting a wave of confessionally rigorous, established congregations directly into the rapidly growing communion of the CRC. Simultaneously, this internal American schism received powerful external validation from the Old World as leaders across the ocean watched the growing theological crisis unfold. The Seceder Church in the Netherlands formally condemned the RCA's stance on Freemasonry and issued an official decree advising all its departing emigrants to take action. The decree advised all its departing emigrants to affiliate exclusively with the Christian Reformed Church upon arriving at their destinations in the United States. This endorsement occurred precisely at the dawn of the largest wave of Dutch migration to North America, bringing thousands of devout believers across the sea. Consequently, as tens of thousands of new immigrants arrived in the Midwest, they bypassed the older, wealthier RCA and moved directly into the pews of the CRC. This massive demographic influx provided the critical mass, financial stability, and institutional momentum necessary to transform the smaller sect into a permanent, highly organized denomination for generations. By the arrival of the 20th century, the Christian Reformed Church had evolved from its humble origins in the Michigan forests into an expansive, highly structured denomination spanning the northern United States. By 1910, the communion had grown to encompass 75,905 adherents, nearly 29,000 communicant members, and 193 organized congregations stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast. This geographic and numerical expansion necessitated the creation of permanent institutional infrastructure to preserve theological uniformity and train future leadership safely without relying on external American agencies. The intellectual and spiritual heart of this maturing denomination was centered in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with the establishment of its theological seminary and the famed John Calvin College. What had begun on a small scale in 1876 developed by 1910 into a respected campus boasting 12 professors and 200 students studying together eagerly each day. The growing seminary was successfully educating nearly all of the 140 ministers serving active pulpits across the country, ensuring complete doctrinal unity for the future. Denominational governance was strictly anchored in the historic Church Order of Dort, operating via a disciplined, tiered presbyterial structure that kept every single congregation firmly aligned together. Local congregations were governed by a consistory of elders and deacons, presided over by the pastor, maintaining strict spiritual order and doctrinal purity within the local flock. These local bodies sent representatives to regional classes, which met 2 to 4 times a year to discuss important matters of faith and local church life, while 6 delegates from each classes convened biennially at the General Synod to establish binding policy for the entire denomination, ensuring complete harmony across the land. At the local level, this structural rigidity was balanced by a deep, practical focus on communal nurture and personal spiritual accountability for every member of the fold. The CRC placed immense emphasis on systematic catechetical instruction for the youth and mandatory house-to-house pastoral visitations to ensure continued moral and doctrinal fidelity among families. These mandatory house-to-house pastoral visitations were designed to ensure moral and doctrinal fidelity remained strong within every single household across the entire expanding independent communion. To shield their children from the perceived secularizing influences of public education, the denomination strongly favored and established independent Christian primary schools in every single town. Concurrently, nearly every local congregation maintained vibrant Sunday schools and young people's societies, creating a comprehensive, self-contained social and religious subculture for their growing families. This comprehensive, self-contained social and religious subculture successfully preserved their specific identity across generations, keeping them completely anchored in their historic transatlantic theological confession. As the 20th century dawned, the protective isolation that had defined the Christian Reformed Church's formative years began to yield to the unavoidable realities of generational change. The turn of the century introduced a critical period of cultural adaptation as the descendants of the original pioneers found themselves increasingly integrated into the social, economic, and political fabric of the United States. The most visible indicator of this systemic transformation was the gradual, often contentious shift in language that strained generational ties within the pulpit. While the older generation viewed the Dutch language as an indispensable bulwark protecting their Orthodox faith from American contamination, the younger, native-born generation increasingly operated in English. This linguistic transition, which began in earnest after 1900, reached completion in the 1930s, accelerated significantly by the participation of young CRC men in World War I. The patriotic social pressures of the wartime era further broke down old barriers, making English the primary language of worship and corporate governance across the region. Despite these deep undercurrents of assimilation, the denomination experienced rapid expansion, driven both by continued immigration from the Netherlands and by new domestic alliances. This rapid growth was further fueled by the strategic absorption of congregations from the dissolving German Reformed Church, widening their cultural reach significantly. By 1920, the CRC's footprint had expanded to encompass 350 organized congregations, stretching firmly from coast to coast. Managing this rapid expansion while navigating the currents of cultural change required skilled leadership, which demanded a clear voice and unwavering theological resolve. Reverend Henry J. Kuyper emerged as a dominant figure during this transitional era, playing a pivotal role as a pastor, editor, and defender of historic orthodoxy. Kuyper recognized that complete cultural isolation was no longer viable. Instead, he pushed the denomination to adopt a posture of critical engagement. This approach allowed for Americanization in language and civic life while fiercely resisting secularism, theological liberalism, and non-reform practices in the modern age. This intentional interaction with the broader American religious landscape inevitably cracked the monolithic theological front of the immigrant church, exposing distinct internal perspectives. By the 1930s, Kuyper explicitly identified three distinct theological factions taking root within the CRC, factions that would continue to shape the denomination's internal dynamics for decades to come. The first group, strict confessional Calvinism, championed a traditional approach seeking to maintain the precise doctrinal boundaries and historical identity of the past. The second wing, American evangelicalism, embraced a form of basic American evangelicalism, prioritizing personal piety, revivalist warmth, and collaborative ministry across denominations. The third faction, moderate reformers, occupied a moderate theological position, seeking to harmonize historic reformed tenets with a more open modern worldview for the rising generation. The conclusion of the Second World War triggered a profound demographic and geographic restructuring of the Christian Reformed Church, permanently altering its identity from a primarily American body to a complex binational communion. While the wartime era had pushed the American wing of the church toward unprecedented levels of cultural integration, the immediate post-war years brought an unexpected influx of thousands of Dutch Calvinist immigrants arriving directly in Canada. Seeking land, economic renewal, and religious freedom after the devastation of Nazi occupation, these new immigrants established vibrant communities across the Canadian provinces and aligned themselves en masse with the CRC. Although the American and Canadian segments shared an identical commitment to the historic three forms of unity, their wildly divergent historical experiences generated intense cultural and theological friction during the 1950s and 1960s. The American wing, having spent a century assimilating into the Midwestern landscape, had embraced a religious style heavily influenced by American evangelicalism, emphasizing personal moral purity and individual salvation. In contrast, the newly arrived Canadian Dutch brought with them a dynamic neo-Calvinist worldview deeply forged by the 20th century theologian and statesman Abraham Kuyper. This perspective rejected the division between the sacred and the secular, asserting instead that Christ's sovereignty demanded active Christian social activism and the transformation of all cultural institutions. These conflicting priorities led to frequent internal debates over church methodology, ecumenical relationships, and the role of the church in modern society. American members often viewed their Canadian brethren as overly intellectual and structurally aggressive, while Canadian members frequently regarded the American church as spiritually inward-looking. Despite these sharp cultural differences, the shared foundational commitment to the absolute authority of Scripture provided a resilient framework for mutual understanding. Over decades of shared governance, the two wings successfully built a cohesive binational identity, resulting in an institutional structure where Canadian congregations grew to comprise approximately 1/4 of the total denominational membership. The late 20th and early 21st centuries confronted the Christian Reformed Church, CRC, with intense cultural pressures, forcing it to apply historic confessions to evolving social movements. After the 1960s, the CRC wrestled to formulate biblical responses to systemic racism and changing expectations regarding gender roles. The internal strain reached an institutional breaking point over women's ordination. In 1995, the General Synod adopted a structural compromise permitting individual regional classes to allow local congregations to ordain women as elders and pastors. Viewing this as an unscriptural surrender to modern culture, more than 40,000 members severed ties with the CRC, many forming or joining smaller, strictly traditional Reformed communions. This institutional trauma demonstrated the enduring power of the separatist spirit that originally drove the 1857 fracture. Historically, this uncompromising mindset thwarted all major structural mergers, including a proposed 1892 federation with the German Reformed Church and three 20th century initiatives to unite the Reformed Church in America, RCA, with American Presbyterian bodies. Today, the CRC remains a tightly knit North American Calvinist denomination deeply rooted in its historic Dutch origins. Its membership is primarily concentrated in the American Midwest, most notably Michigan and Iowa, while maintaining significant communities in California, New Jersey, and Canada. The denomination is widely recognized for its robust commitment to higher education, rigorous Christian scholarship, critical engagement with secular worldviews, and its insistence on bearing a distinct Christian witness in cultural and civic life. The complex history of division eventually yielded a monumental moment of institutional healing. In the early 2000s, the leadership of the historic Pillar Church in Holland, Michigan, the very congregation founded by Albertus van Raalte that witnessed the heartbreaking local schisms of the 19th century, embraced a vision for spiritual reconciliation. Seeking to heal the structural trauma that had divided the city's Dutch Calvinist community for generations, the church engaged in years of deliberate dialogue. This intentional pursuit of peace culminated in 2012, when Pillar Church was granted official dual affiliation with both the RCA and the CRC. This historic milestone, achieved after 130 years of formal division, demonstrated that the deep ideological divides of the Great Dutch Fracture could ultimately be bridged. The fracturing of a community over deeply held convictions forces us to examine the thin line between holy preservation and destructive isolation. When looking closely at the events of 1857, we observe a people who willingly traded physical security and ecclesiastical peace for the absolute protection of what they deemed the pure gospel truth. Their struggle invites us to consider what compromises we might be making today in the name of cultural comfort and modern relevance. In what ways does our current desire for societal acceptance subtly erode the core theological convictions we claim to hold? At what point does the necessary pursuit of doctrinal purity cross the line into a harmful spirit of division that damages the global body of Christ? Join us next week as we turn the page to the next major theological earthquake in this transatlantic heritage, the Great Common Grace Split of 1924. We will untangle the fierce institutional conflict between the Christian Reformed Church and the newly emerging Protestant Reformed churches. Discover how a dense, abstract theological debate regarding God's general attitude toward the secular world completely fractured neighborhoods, divided families, and redrew the borders of Orthodox Calvinism in America. If you want to dive deeper into the historical crises, theological shifts, and profound stories that have shaped religious history, make sure to subscribe to the Theology today. By subscribing, hitting the notification bell, and engaging with our videos, you help us bring dense, sophisticated church history into clear focus for contemporary believers. Click subscribe today to ensure you never miss an episode.